Okay, we are recording. Great. All right.
We're live?
We are live.
Okay.
So thank you everybody for coming today. This is the 5th installment in our Act 64 Brown Bag series. And today we're going to hear from Bryan Redmond all about the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and how to secure funding for some clean water projects that you may be working on. So with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Bryan.
All right. Thanks, Maddie.
Sure.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us on this presentation on the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. As Maddie mentioned, this is a larger effort by the department on Act 64 of Vermont Clean Water Act outreach. And today I'm going to basically try to provide a SRF 101 broader overview of the program. My name is Bryan Redmond. I am the Water Infrastructure Finance Program Supervisor. So there's a lot there, but my core role is I supervise the project managers, so we call them project developers, the two staff in the program that work with the municipalities on the application processing, and the financial managers for the SRF programs. I just did a dry run with a new staff member that came into the program, and she quickly reminded me that the SRF has a language, State Revolving Fund has a language of its own. So sometimes I can't help myself. So if I start rattling off acronyms or terms that you can't understand, please ask questions as we go along. The other thing I'll point out on this first slide is the Water Infrastructure Financing Programs logo on the top. That's a branded effort to sort of be a program name for all the financing opportunities that are administered through the Facilities Engineering Division. We do a lot of our communications for the program through Constant Contact, and so you'll receive emails from the Water Infrastructure Financing Program. So it may go into your spam or your clutter folder, but that's us reaching out to you for information or sending out information. So we've been sending a lot of these out lately, so that's who we are. All right. So again, I tried to structure this presentation. The SRF programs are pretty massive, detailed programs, but tried to structure this as a very broad overview, Clean Water State Revolving Fund 101, if you will. So I'm going to start off by going through how the programs function, sort of the mechanics behind the program, some of the opportunities available. This discusses the Clean Water Revolving Funds plus all these other funding programs that are administered through the Water Infrastructure Finance Programs. A little bit diving into a little more detail on specific projects and how to get started with a project, and then we'll talk about a little bit about the advantages of coming through the program. So this first slide here shows, it's an EPA slide, Environmental Protection Agency. It shows the overall structure of how the program works. And basically, the money coming into the program, the funding coming into the program is from the Environmental Protection Agency capitalization grants. This is an annual process. The grant amounts, the allotments are released, and then the state has to go and apply for them. The grant requires a state match, and this is done annually through the legislative process. The capital bill is the vehicle that we use to obtain the state match annually in order to capitalize the federal funds. It's a 5-to-1 setup, so 5 federal dollars to each state dollar, so it's a really, really good deal for the states. The money, once it's received, is then deposited into the revolving loan fund. From there, we make loan agreements to, in this case, municipalities for water pollution control projects. So once the money's in the fund, we make the loans to the municipalities to do work. The municipalities then begin the construction of the improvements, and they pay their contractors. And this is a little more detail here, but basically once the contractors are paid, the community comes back into the program for reimbursement of their expenses. So it's a reimbursement-based program. Once the municipality receives the functional use of the project being financed, it's time to start into the loan repayment phase. So these are generally 20 to 30-year loans, and the municipalities pay back annually. So there's an annual payment that's amortized over that time. It's a substantial source of funding. Those repayments go back into the fund and are made available to communities for future projects. The projection for this upcoming fiscal year is about $12 million in additional capitalization into the fund from loan repayments. So that's the revolving loan fund side of things.
What's the total size of the fund altogether?
Currently available? Approximately $80 million, and we'll cover that in a future slide. So at the core of the programs is what's called the priority list. So annually we develop a document called the intended use plan. That's sort of the overarching policy document on how the state intends to administer the funds on an annual basis. The largest part of that document is what's referred to as the project priority list. We basically annually collect all the projects that may be constructed during the year and put them into a system of priorities. The criteria for how a project is ranked is actually in the Environmental Protection Rules, Chapter 2. And we generate a statewide construction priority list. Historically, demand has exceeded available funds, so the priority is a very important aspect. Right now, that's not the case. We have the funding available to meet all the demands currently in the queue. So that's a very important point that I'll weave into the entire presentation. And in order to be eligible to receive construction funds through the program, a project must be listed on the priority list. So that is really the entry gate into ultimately building the project is through the priority list. A good Vermonti way to remember the cycle is to tie it to the seasonality of things. So this is an annual process. We're constantly doing it. Programs, and basically when the snow starts to fly, that's when we send out our call for projects out to the municipalities. So we, through our constant contact list and web posting, we send out an annual call for projects. That happens sometime November, December. When the staff starts to flow, that's when we have our draft list available. So we're in that right now. And then the funding becomes available once the leaves start to turn. So once the state matches come in through the legislative process, all the funds have been deposited into the accounts, and we're ready to start funding projects. And that's usually around October 1st. So as I mentioned, we're in the process right now for developing what's the federal fiscal year 2016 intended use plan. Here's the schedule, and the two things that I want to point out on the current schedule, two key dates, is we have a public meeting coming up April 28th. It'll actually be several of you are online, but it'll actually be in this room that we're in the Winooski room on April 28th, and it's a combined meeting between the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So if you're interested in learning more about the programs and a little more specificity about what we're talking about today, that's a good thing to try to attend. It makes me think that we should also put a WebEx out there. Good mechanism. So April 28th, that's the public meeting. We'll have a draft priority list for both programs available and a draft intended use plan. So the intended use plan discusses how we're planning on doing things like the Green Project Reserve, or how we plan to subsidize projects, or how we plan to implement certain requirements. So that's the time that we seek feedback from the public on the direction that we're heading with the program. Also, June 15th, that's the time period to actually review the documents and get public comments into us. So anytime we get feedback from stakeholders, municipalities, the general public about where the program's headed, that's definitely appreciated. If there's any municipalities on the line or engineering consultants, we will also accept applications up until that June 15th deadline through the public comment period. Again, the priority list process happens annually, so if there's a project that may be constructed during that year, we want to be as lenient as possible to get them on that priority list. So those are the key dates there. Okay, this graph a little bit out of date now, but what it's showing a couple things. One thing that it's showing is that a number of sources of funding that are available for water pollution control and abatement facilities. So pollution control projects, there's a number of different sources. I'll go through those in a second. The programs are large. I read in a report a few weeks ago the total amount of funding for this activity through the history of Vermont, so really dating back to the 60s when the federal grant started coming in to the state, is about $750 million. And of that, about $350 million is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So it is a significant portion of the total pot. The programs in general, as many of you probably know, in the 60s and 70s started off as large federal granting programs to get the initial push to get some of these facilities built. Over time, we've been transitioning more into a period of state grants and now a period of state grants and loans with a more focus on the state loan side of things. So it's been on a certain trajectory over time, but there's been an awful lot of money pumped into the state for these activities. The other thing this graph shows along the bottom of the bar charts, the green and then that next block is the annual annual funding coming into the programs from the EPA grants and then the state match. As you can see, they're relatively consistent and pretty predictable over time. On the right side of the chart, what you see are a number of different funding sources that I'll tick through quickly. The top one, STAG, that stands for State and Tribal Assistance Grants. Those are EPA funds for projects. They're grants. They're essentially legislative appropriations at the federal level. They've all but stopped. We haven't seen one in the state for a number of years now. But I believe they're still authorized, but they just politically aren't happening. The next four bars running down the right-hand side here, phosphorus grants, CSO grants, dry weather flow grants, and sludge and septage grants. Now, those are the state grants for pollution control facilities, and they're authorized in Title 10, Chapter 55. They're grants specific to those categories, and so the eligibilities the authorizations are in state statutes. The allocation for the actual grants, the actual money itself, also runs through the legislative process. So while the authorization is established in statute, the actual funding for a project that may qualify under one of those categories is a function of working through the legislative process. Phosphorus grants were 100%. They were repealed out of statute last year. So the last recipient of that grant was the Village of Waterbury. We are just finishing up a $7 million phosphorus upgrade at that plant. So they'll be the last municipality to take advantage of the phosphorus granting. CSO, that stands for Combined Sewer Overflow. Maximum amount of eligible grant is 25% of the project cost for the CSO element of the project. Dry weather flow, that's up to 35%, and correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, that's basically a direct discharge to the water of the state.
Correct answer, each water is of the state.
Okay. And sludge and septage, which is basically a allocation of up to 50% to increase capacity and capability for municipal wastewater treatment facilities to receive septic from other towns or other areas. So basically pumping or hauling sewage to the municipal wastewater treatment facility. The Recovery Act, ARRA, that was the stimulus funding, a big blip in 2009. The programs were substantially capitalized and we were offering significant subsidies. Very busy time in the program's history and a significant source of funding, and now we're seeing that come back to us on the repayment side of things. And then again, as I mentioned early on, the bars going across the bottom, the green, and then the next bar up, that's the state revolving funds. That's the EPA funds. That's the bread and butter that we have going right now, and as they're indicated there, they're pretty steady. The red line on top is, I believe the source of that is the Clean Water Needs Survey. It's the annualized need for the clean water facilities. So what that shows is a funding gap, and a funding gap that's growing. What we're engaged in right now, every 3 years we do the Clean Water Needs Survey, but there's another effort going right now in relation to the Vermont Clean Water Act, Act 64, a large stakeholder group to sort of identify and hone in on these needs for Vermont, outside of just projecting, to really try to understand the need better. So this is an area that we're actively engaged in working on.
I had a question from somebody online. I don't know if you're going to get to this, but what is the interest rate on the loans?
So the interest rate is, technically it's 0%, but functionally it's 2%. We actually call the 2% an admin fee. From a mechanical standpoint, it goes into a separate account. But from a municipality standpoint, from a borrower standpoint, the interest rate is 2%. The loan term can range from 20 to 30 years. The 30-year loan term is a new authorization. So it's really, the loan term is defined really based on the expected useful life of the asset being financed. So that's how that's determined.
Thanks.
The next slide.
Sorry.
So here's the 80 million that I put out there at the beginning of the presentation. So this pie chart includes both the clean water and the drinking water. The bright green's the clean water. That's approximately at about 68 million available right now. What's happening in the program right now is we have not been seeing a lot of activity, a lot of construction projects being financed. The few that have been going forward have been going with USDA Rural Development. There's a lot of people that speculate that the uncertainty around the Lake Champlain TMDL is basically slowing a lot of the progress of actually building projects down, and others point the finger at broader economic conditions, but probably some combination of both. Based on my last slide with that annualized red line, we know that the need is out there. We're probably underestimating the need. And as we go around the state and meet with municipalities, we're starting to sort of feel the rumble of projects. We're seeing more municipalities engaging in engineering studies. There's been a lot of deferred improvements occurring over the last couple of years, and I think that the need is really starting to come to the forefront, and we're starting to see more activity. We know, or we speculate that the 80 million or the 68 million in the clean water SRF case will probably go pretty quickly once the lights go on. The program can cover a wide variety of projects, from a $100,000 replacement of a failed decentralized system in a small town in Vermont up to a $30 million wastewater treatment facility in South Burlington. So it really does run the gamut. We do know that there are some large municipal projects that are in the planning stages, And in combination with a lot of that deferral on capital improvements, we do anticipate this funding to go pretty quickly once it does start to go. I don't anticipate that being this year, maybe not next fiscal year, but I think in the 2 to 5 year window, we're going to really see the activity pick up. One of the main messages that we try to deliver to municipalities is it makes it a really good time to actually do a project, to execute the project. If you know you have a high priority project, you know it's something that that has to be done, it is a really good time. Obviously, we have the funding available for whole project funding, which is not always the case looking back at the historical record. We have loan subsidies, and I'll touch in greater detail on those in future slides. And then, of course, these types of projects are always subject to inflationary factors. The cost of constructing the project is just going to go up over time, and starting to see rising interest rates, although that's a little bit more shorter to mid-range, but it is a factor that the market rates will likely start ticking up. Okay. So a laundry list of projects. I don't love this slide, but laundry list of projects here. I think the take-home message for the Clean Water SRF is nearly any type of municipally owned or sponsored project that has a water quality benefit is eligible. Our bread and butter in the program historically has been refurbishment and upgrade of the municipal wastewater treatment facilities. The collection systems that collect the sewage and deliver it to the treatment plant, upgrades of those, the pump stations, sanitary and storm separation, and combined sewer overflow abatement, and then again the sludge handling and septage receiving. Those are the categories that the $350 million that we have awarded, the bulk majority of those awards come in the form of those projects. We are starting to see an uptick in stormwater projects coming through the program, some of the larger municipal projects. There's a partnership between the Ecosystem Restoration Program and the Clean Water SRF. We're joint funding, I believe, 6 stormwater projects at municipalities this upcoming fiscal year. So the Clean Water SRF and other funding partners such as USDA Rural Development make excellent sources of match for those larger stormwater projects. We're also seeing starting to see more in the realm of some of these newer type project eligibilities, maybe not as traditional as some of the other types of projects, in climate resiliency and flood vulnerability, watershed-wide projects, green infrastructure projects, and of course we're actually targeting our subsidies, which I'll talk about later, towards asset management, capital improvement, long-term planning at the municipalities. We really see that as probably the most important tool in trying to incentivize that type of activity. So nearly any type of water quality project is eligible. It's a very diverse gamut, so I would encourage you, if you have something, to get in contact with the program.
Yeah, so I work for Forest Parks and Recreation, and we came here to see if there was any tie to and I'm looking at your list, you know, climate and flood resiliency, watershed projects, any tie that we can make to some of the stuff that we're working on. And I don't know if you can expand on that in any way, what those projects might look like, what might be available for funding, or how they would work.
Sure, and I'll go into, in future slides, into detail. There was a substantial overhaul to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund through legislation at the federal level in 2014, known as the Water Resources Reform and Development Act. It made some substantial alterations to the Water Pollution Control Act as well as the Clean Water SRF. And one of the things that it did is it really broadened out the eligibility. So I think there is a nexus between the types of projects that you may be talking about and the SRF program. One of the items, one of the key items in the way the SRF program works is right now on the Clean Water SRF, it's municipal borrowers or privately owned, municipally sponsored. So the municipality has to be involved. One of the changes that WRDA authorized at the federal level is loans to private entities. I'll touch on one of the major legislative initiatives we have going this session, which aims to incorporate a lot of the changes that were authorized through the WRDA. In terms of the private loans to private entities, that apparently is a pretty sensitive issue. So what the department is committed to is providing a report within the next year back to the legislature on a program for loans to private entities, how it may work, how it would be administered. So it's a roundabout way of answering your question, but the bottom line as it currently stands is a municipality or municipal sponsorship would need to be the loan recipient.
Right, but it might be changing in the future.
Yes.
Another quick question from someone online. How many decentralized sewer systems have been funded over time?
I'm looking over at Robert, one of our engineers. Yeah, not many. You say fewer than half a dozen?
Yeah, I mean, one subpark, there's Rygate, Newport Town, and I believe there's another one. Or, what's that? Possibly.
Yeah.
Not many.
Yeah, very, very, very few, but it is an eligible project cost. We have a few of them going right now. Robert,
Addison is in process.
Addison, Rygate are two projects. The town of Waitsfield has been building new decentralized systems. That's actually currently being done under one of the STAG grants from a number of years ago, but will likely be an SRF recipient to continue their effort to build more decentralized treatment capacity. Okay, so some of the funding opportunities, this is looking at the broader water infrastructure financing programs, and I'd be remiss if I didn't plug some of the other programs, but the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, again, that's its parallel program, another large federally funded revolving loan fund that's administered through FED, and that's for funding municipal and I should just say public water system infrastructure upgrades. Some private entities are eligible under the drinking water SRF. Water planning loans, that's a really popular program. It's basically zero interest loans to plan and design drinking water projects. There's some loan forgiveness provisions in the program, so there is some opportunities to undertake planning and design activities for drinking water infrastructure and have that be forgiven. Water source protection loans, those are loans to purchase land or easements to protect public water sources. It's been in place since 1997, and we've had 3 borrowers in the program. So it's not extremely active, but we get inquiries, once a year or so. But it is available. Not to confuse everyone, but we do have Vermont-only Clean Water State Revolving Loan Funds and Vermont-only Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds. They're different than the federal programs. They have a very similar name, but they're capitalized exclusively with state dollars, not state match dollars, different source of funding, usually special appropriations out of the legislature, and they're used primarily for projects that have eligibility issues on the federal level. So there's some sticking point in the federal program, so we have these alternate source of funds to be able to fund projects. Currently, there's about a balance of $400,000 available in the Vermont-only Clean Water Fund, Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund. There's just so many terminologies that are alike now. I got to make sure I specify. So there's about $400,000 there, and we've been looking at probably capitalizing a project with those funds pretty quickly here, because the best place for those monies is out in the hands of municipalities, and again, getting that repayment stream going. On-site loans, a relatively new program for the agency. It's 3 years old now. It is a program specific to provide funding to homeowners directly to homeowners for failed on-site potable water supplies, so contaminated private well or a well that's gone dry, or a failing wastewater system, on-site septic. And the two key pieces, there's a few different bells and whistles and criteria to be eligible for that fund, but the two key items are is the system A has failed, and that's a confirmed failure, and B, that the borrowers are not credit worthy in the commercial marketplace. So they've been denied financing from a bank or a credit union, and so it's set up as a program of last resort, if you will. Pollution control grants, we already touched on the state grant, and then the planning advances. These are another legislative appropriation. There is a little bit of funding available right now in the program, I believe about $40,000. And really what the purpose of the planning advance program is to provide funding to municipalities that currently do not have municipal services for them to investigate the feasibility for putting in municipal infrastructure. The big key with those and the big benefit, there's a lot of uncertainty with that type of endeavor. So the planning advance is a deferred loan, so it's not paid back until construction is complete. So we have some from the 1960s and 70s of municipalities that investigated putting in a public water system or a municipally owned wastewater treatment facility, did not do that. And so those loans are sitting on the books, but they won't actually pay back until or if the project is constructed.
And would that work for stormwater also?
Jim, I'd have to check. It's probably tied to the individual appropriations that come from the legislature to put money into the fund. I know the $40,000 that I referenced was specific for wastewater. We've used them for drinking water as well, but I think it's really tied to the language that is appropriated. So I can look into the current allocation and see if stormwater would be eligible. Okay, diving into a little more detail on actually doing a project in the Clean Water SRF and getting your ducks in a row. These are the broad-based, higher-level steps of doing a project. Step 0, I think, is a pretty debatable step. I guess what that's getting at is if you already know what the problem is, but defining the problem or knowing the problem often is something that happens during step 1. So step 1 is the planning phase, and that's really a pretty broad and all-encompassing term. We could do things like asset management planning or capital improvement planning under step 1. It would fall under the planning realm. But more traditionally, what the step 1 is the preliminary engineering report, or the evaluation, the analysis, with the deliverable being a preliminary engineering report. And what that document does is it takes the problem, looks at a range of alternatives at solving the problem, and at the end of that analysis, you come out with a selected alternative and a preliminary cost estimate for the selected alternative. Oftentimes, communities will actually go for voter approval at the conclusion of step 1 when they have their selected alternative and a preliminary cost estimate. One key factor with the revolving loan funds is that they are, the projects or the loans do require municipal voter approval, which is in the form of a general obligation bond. So the loans are secured by the full faith and credit of the municipality. So that's a major step in the process. And really, once that bond is in place, we know that is a real project that is likely going to move forward through either the state program or USDA rural development. Step 2 takes that recommended alternative and is the design phase. Basically, the outcome of the design phase is a set of blueprints for the project, plans and specifications, basically a set of documents that can be submitted for public bid and moving towards the construction phase. Also, the outcome of step 2 is making sure all your permits are secured and the project's ready to be built. So step 3 is the bidding, procurement, and construction phase of the project. Basically, you take those design plans and specifications. These are publicly bid projects. You execute contracts with a contractor or multiple contractors and build the project. Once the project is complete and the municipality receives the beneficial use of the infrastructure being financed, that's when we look at the repayment phase, and I'll go into more detail on repayments because it is one of the advantages of the program. But the repayment phase is basically the step after construction, and again, these are usually 20 to 30 year repayment terms, and the repayments made on an annual basis. So some of the advantages to the or to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, certainly the subsidy. As I mentioned before, the Water Resources Reform and Development Act, WRDA, it made a lot of changes, brought a lot of new requirements into the program. But one of those was an authorization for the states to use between 0 and 30% of the federal funding coming into the program on an annual basis for additional subsidy. And that basically equates to a little bit over, well, I'll just call it $2 million a year in terms of subsidies available to loan recipients. And I'll talk, and it's such a big advantage and one of the things that we're really putting out there to try to encourage people. I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide on that. In terms of the delayed repayment, it's a big benefit. Basically, we set the repayment schedule out for 2 years following completion of the project. So once a project is complete, construction is substantially complete, there's a 1-year warranty period where all the infrastructure being placed would be under warranty. Any sort of issues are getting resolved. And then after the warranty period concludes, all the final disbursements are made. They get a 1-year grace period, and then the first full payment is due out after that 1 year. So that gives the municipality the time they need to raise the revenue to pay the loan. If a project comes through all phases, so step 1, the preliminary engineering, step 2, the design, step 3, the construction, the way that is structured is we'll issue a loan for the preliminary phase and we'll set the repayment start date 5 years out from the completion of that project. So the intent is that, by project I mean the preliminary engineering report, and so the intent is that the municipality will never start paying on that. They move to the final design of the project, and we'll issue a new loan for that. It'll suck up the preliminary engineering loan, and so those will be consolidated, and we'll delay the repayment out again based on when we anticipate the final design to be complete. Finally, when the project actually goes to construction, we suck both those previous loans up into one consolidated loan and delay the repayment out 2 years from completion. So we give adequate time for the project to allow development while providing the necessary financing, with the end result being 2 years following completion of the project when you actually start repaying on the whole amount. Technical oversight and project oversight. We have both design engineering and construction engineering staff that oversee the project. So we have engineering staff that is looking at the preliminary engineering reports, the plans and specifications, and the contract documents. Their view on it is biddability, constructability, regulatory compliance, programmatic compliance, and in general, just an independent set of third-party eyes to look at the work. So it's a real benefit for the municipality to have this third-party person with excellent technical expertise looking at the project, reviewing all the steps in the project, and issuing the approvals. Finally, there's a number of steps in executing a project, sometimes overly complicated, but we develop all the documents that are required through each of the steps in a standard format so they're acceptable by other funding agencies. Example documents would be the preliminary engineering reports, the environmental reports, the contract documents, etc. And so those are developed in a standard format so they would be acceptable by our Community Development Block Grant Program, the Vermont version of HUD. That accurate, Faith? The Vermont version of HUD, or more namely USDA Rural Development, who is another significant source of funding for these types of projects. Eric, I don't know. Eric Law is here from USDA. I don't know if you want to say anything about USDA or.
Sure. I guess if you went back a few slides, don't do that. When you talked about the funding matrix, we do have what we call the Water Environmental Program, which inserts about $15 million annually in Vermont for water, wastewater, stormwater, green infrastructure projects. So usually the split is about $4 million grant, $11 million in.
So another significant source of funding for these types of projects. We meet quarterly with USDA to look at the projects that we anticipate going forward. And really, the real intent of those meetings is not only working on things like getting our documents in alignment, but also really looking at where the maximum benefit is to the municipality based on the funding agencies. Of course, they're not the same at the federal level. There's some benefits, some communities benefit more from USDA, some benefit more from the SRF. So we look at those projects and try to figure that out and then go approach the municipalities to let them know where they're going to get their best deal. All right, the subsidy. I promised I'd come back to it. So we recently amended the current fiscal year to broaden the eligibility for loan subsidies, and the approach that we're taking is basically incentivizing planning. So preliminary engineering reports, final designs, asset management planning, capital improvement planning, things of that nature. So what we're proposing to do with the current fiscal year is we're providing up to 50% in subsidy for eligible step 1, which is the planning, or step 2 activities, and with a maximum of up to $500,000 per borrower. So it is significant. We actually have a design project in the state that is $1 million design. So it is a great opportunity. This is the current cycle. We have the public meeting on April 28th for the future cycle. We still have internal conversations to be had, but we will likely roll a similar program out for this next fiscal year. Really doubling down on the planning. We strongly believe that's one of the best ways that we can invest this subsidy money. It's all about, and from our standpoint, developing a queue of high priority, ready to proceed projects. And we see this as the way to do that. So it's available now for these projects. So if you have a project that you know you're going to do and it's at step 0 or step 1, you theoretically in the very near future could come in and have 50% of the planning paid for during this fiscal year. So June 30th of 2016 is the cutoff for that. And then be able to enter the design phase in the subsequent fiscal year and potentially get 50% of that forgiven. So that's a really great tool that we've imported into the program, and it's a really good tool also to have the developers go out to the communities and have something to talk about and to get people excited about. So. That's currently what we have on tap for the subsidy. Okay, asset management and fiscal sustainability. The fiscal sustainability plan is a requirement now of the borrowers coming through the Clean Water SRF. It's another one of these WRDA requirements. We're a little behind in the implementation, but we should have compliance documents and certification statements and templates to use coming out in the next, I'd say, 2 weeks, one to 2 weeks. We're right on the verge of releasing them. They're very similar. Of course, EPA had to introduce yet another term. Fiscal sustainability is a lot like asset management, but perhaps you could consider it asset management light. We all think that this is really the future of infrastructure management. It's a good thing. At the same time, we're very cognizant of adding additional barriers and administrative burden to an already complicated program. So our initial approach with these documents that we'll be releasing on the fiscal sustainability is to start small to make sure we have our federal compliance in place. With that said, the tools will be there for a municipality that sees the light and wants to take it to new levels. The tools will be available to take the fiscal sustainability planning as far as they may want to. Also, on the drinking water side, I'll mention we have asset management planning grants. Now, fiscal sustainability is a term that's used for clean water, SRF. On the drinking water side, it's not a requirement, but we've recently sent out a notification for asset management planning grants. Jim Siriano in the drinking water program is the contact for those. The proposal is to basically provide a minimum of 10,000 up to 20,000 grants to municipalities to engage in asset management planning activities. It doesn't necessarily need to be a full comprehensive plan per se, but it could be a component of a plan. One of the things, one of the requirements of the grant is that there's an in-kind time match requirement or the in-kind match requirement from the municipalities. And what we're really trying to drive the municipalities towards is a time match of their staff. These are living, breathing documents. They need to be used. It's a management tool, so it's very important to have the municipalities, both the operators and the municipal officials, engaged at on the operations level of actually looking at the assets, making a condition assessment on the assets, and then also bringing in the local leaders to talk about things like level of service goals, to talk about things like long-term funding strategy. So we're requiring that match. So it's not just a document that an engineering consultant is going to prepare and hand over. The municipalities have to be involved. Okay, finally, H610, that's the bill that we have going in the legislature this year. It's, I believe, still on the House side, hopefully through the House side by the end of the week. It's a substantial overhaul of the two statutes that govern the revolving loan funds and the state grant programs. Those are Title 10, Chapter 55. The Conservation and Development Statute, and then Title 24, Chapter 120, which is municipal and county government, and that's where the revolving loans are. So there's really a substantial change to what we're proposing in these statutes. Some of the key changes, the water pollution control grants, I mentioned there was the four, now 3 categories of grants. The proposal is to eliminate those grants, so there will no longer be the categorical grants, the 25, 35, 50. And what we're talking about doing is a single water pollution control grant that will be determined through a system of priorities. Those priorities are currently in Chapter 2 of the Environmental Protection Rules. The department will be looking at modernizing and revising those priorities within the next year. We anticipate, as it currently stands, this legislation would be enacted in July, but the categorical, the existing grant structure would be maintained for some future time because we would need the revision of the priorities, which would be a public stakeholder involvement process in place before we move to the new method for determining pollution control grant eligibility. The other piece to this is the percentages will change. Basically, the amount of grant will be determined not by the project type. It will be determined by affordability factors. So we'll be looking at things like median household income, employment statistics, and population trends to determine the affordability of a community to execute one of these projects. And then the grant will be, the grant percentage will be structured to meet those needs. I believe, I should probably back off this, but I believe the maximum grant eligibility in the current draft is 35%. WRDA changes, I talked a lot about that throughout the presentation. The key one is the loans to privates. It's apparently somewhat of a controversial issue at the State House. So what we're agreeing to do is provide a report back to the legislature on loans to private entities. And then a number of just technical corrections, stuff that just doesn't apply to the programs as they're currently administered, a number of things that have caused us a lot of administrative headache over the years. We're really cleaning this up. We've had a lot of historical knowledge walk off the job through the retirement incentive, and likely the remaining chunk of historical knowledge not that far behind. So it's really great that we're making these changes now for the benefit of the program and just cleaning things up. So the entry point into the programs are the project development staff. For the Clean Water SRF, the project lead is Teresa Thomas. Teresa's about 6 weeks now on the job. She's excellent. She's going to be a real asset for the program. So I encourage you to reach out directly. She's going right into the deep end. Reach out directly to Teresa if you have a question about a clean water project. And then on the drinking water side of things, Ashley Lucht is the drinking water SRF project lead. Ashley's been with the program for a number of years, has a wealth of experience, knows the programs, and municipalities seem to really enjoy working with Ashley. Both are available to help you through the application process, to just talk generally about capital improvement needs, but also on assisting communities on the asset management planning side of things, rate setting, things of that nature as it relates to the loan program. So great resources for you to have. With that, I think that's what I had.
Awesome. Thank you. That was great. Are there questions in the room? I posed it to some people online. I haven't gotten any yet, so people in the room have questions.
I'm just wondering, you said asset management was required by WRDA, so it's a requirement for getting a clean water SRF loan?
A fiscal sustainability plan, which is an asset management-like activity, and we asset management-like, but also light. And we're sort of dialing in exactly where we're headed with it. Robert's been leading the effort, and it's really, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we recognize the barriers to the program. We recognize there's already a lot of administrative burden. While we think this is a very good thing to do, we're starting off very small and going to build off that. So we're getting the sort of core components, guidance, forms, templates together to comply, because it is required. It's a requirement of the program. But again, we're building the template so if the municipality wants to dive in a little deeper, they can.
And Jim, the most important thing to remember is fiscal sustainability only applies to the discrete project area for which they're applying for a loan. It's not system-wide or municipality-wide. If they're upgrading the headworks of the treatment plant, it would only apply to those components related to the headworks. Then in a piecemeal fashion, as they refurbish other components, we would apply it and tie it all together. It's a starting point. We're starting a discussion to get them thinking about how to better fund operation and maintenance of these very complicated systems.
You mentioned about you're doing a report to the legislature on private entities, and the possibility of including them on some of these different kinds of projects. Would that include or encompass nonprofits, or?
It would. I think part of the report is to understand what some of these projects done by private entities would look like, so that the types of borrowers that we would see, that's definitely part of the report, because I don't know if we necessarily have our head around that. It could be nonprofits, for sure. I could see that being pretty easily included. For example, we have a brownfields project in Burlington where the developer actually wants the loan to make a brownfields redevelopment project whole. And they have about a $5 million funding gap on a $30 million, $25 million project.
Right.
And they want to borrow from the SRF, but for that gap, for the remediation of the soils and for the stormwater controls, but the developer is currently not eligible. So we'll need to look at both the nonprofit, the private for-profit, the individuals, individual people, watershed groups, things like that. So we'll have to look at the full gamut of who, and then the next question is how, and that's a whole another question. We work with a lot of third-party institutions with these programs. We're involved with the Vermont Economic Development Authority on privately owned public water infrastructure. We work with the Vermont Municipal Bond Bank and the People's United Bank on the municipal side of things, and then on the on-site loan program, loans to individuals, we work with the Opportunities Credit Union out of Burlington. So we have these other outside partners. So how the funds are administered needs to be figured out as well.
Quick question from online. So this person's asking, is it true that other funding program money can also piggyback on this money to leverage multiple funding sources?
Yeah, joint funding is always an option. Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
And that's common with USDA, and again, we have like the ERP stormwater projects, so it is a common occurrence.
Cool.
Hey, Brian, could you speak a little bit more to the initial loan for the preliminary engineering and how that relates to when a municipal sponsor would have to do a full savings title pledge?
Sure. So the borrowers, it needs to be a municipal borrower. So in Title 24, Chapter 120, the municipalities have the authority under the SRF statute to borrow for those activities through a municipal legislative action. So by signing the application at a duly warned meeting. So they can apply and borrow those funds for step one and even step two, provided that funding is then considered and included in the subsequent authorization for the project. So by the city or a town or a village signing the application, or a fire district signing the application, that is, they have the municipal authority in the SRF statute, not considering their own personal or their own municipal statutes. They have the ability to do that through signing the application.
All right. No more questions online. Anybody else in the room? All right. Well, thank you again, Brian, for coming and telling us all about this. I feel like I learned a lot, so thank you.
Thank you.
And the next brown bag will be the 6th one in the series, and that's going to be in April. So look for an email from me for that. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.